Hello, welcome to Into the Fire, a Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series.
Hi, this is Jerome Davis. I'm the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater Company, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Into the Fire, the Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series on all subjects theatrical. Today, David Edgar, the esteemed playwright from England, will be joining us again. David, welcome, and thank you for doing our podcast for the second time.
Well, I'm very pleased to do so, and very pleased to be back.
David's play Here in America will premiere here in America in December at Burning Coal Theater. It had its English premiere at the Orange Tree Theater in Richmond, just south of London, about a year ago, and its American premiere will take place in Raleigh and run the 4th through the 21st of December at Burning Coal. So, David, I'm just going to jump right in. We've just come out of a read-through of the play with the cast, or most of the cast, and what I wanted to ask you about foremost, the play is about an event that principally took place 70 odd years ago, and yet it feels very timely. Was that intentional on your part? Were you writing about the present as you delved into this historical moment?
No, I wasn't. I had the idea. I mean, it's been with me for a long time, and I think I started, which isn't always the case with me. I just started with what seemed to me an extraordinary dramatic idea, which happened to be a real story, which is these two men who were friends and who had this argument in the woods about a decision that one of them had to make, and there were two famous men then and now, and that nobody had dramatized this. The two men talk about the incident in their own biographies, where they tell a rather different view of the story of what happened. There are two other characters, but it just seemed that the core conversation between two men, as it happens in the pouring rain, having this confrontation which is about great matters of public importance, but also about their own friendship and what it meant in the middle of the 20th century or early in the 20th century as well to be immigrants to America, or from immigrant families coming to America and going through the extraordinary prosperity followed by the terrible crash of the late 20s and the early 1930s, and what that led to people believing and wanting, which was then also developed and changed during the Second World War, and then after the war, the kind of extraordinary reversals which led to the McCarthy period and the anti-communist crusade that was mounted in the late 40s and the early 50s, and to find a single conversation that happened between two close friends who happened to be great artists, whose work we still know and love. It seemed extraordinary. Nobody had done it before, but I've done it now.
Those two men were Arthur Miller, who is very well known in the U.S. As the playwright of The Crucible, Death of a Salesman, All My Sons, which is running here in Raleigh right now, and of course many others, and Elia Kazan, who's somewhat less known, I think, because because of what happened during this event. But you have talked about the impact of Miller and those kind of mid-century American naturalistic playwrights on your own work and your own life. Can you talk a little bit more about Miller particularly, but also Kazan as well, in terms of their influence on you?
Yes, I think because there was a huge revolution in the English theatre in the late 1950s, I think we tend to think we tend not to think about what happened in the middle of the 20th century so much, which was a theatre, people like Noel Coward, Terence Rattigan, very sort of elegant boulevard writers about often a slightly unfair caricature, but it's certainly the caricature that's come down to us of writing about witty upper middle class conversation in country houses, or fancy drawing rooms in London. And because the theatre of the 1950s overthrew that, that tends to be seen as what you might call the origin myth, the creation myth of the contemporary British theatre, which I'm a part. But I think that tends to downgrade the importance of the great playwrights of the middle of the 20th century in America. And obviously they include Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller and a number of others, including Clifford Odets and Fulton Welber. And I think that combination, and because a lot of them came out of the group theatre, which was in the 1930s, which in a sense is a very paradoxical institution because it was the theatre that discovered how to do naturalism, or influenced by Stanislavski and the great Russian movement, which gave us the works of Chekhov. But that was taken up and developed by the group theatre and Lee Strasberg and others, and that had two aspects really. One was that it was a theatre that was struggling more in a more detailed and more committed way than perhaps had happened anywhere else before, except in Russia, to find a way of presenting naturalistically real life, on the stage, and particularly, to express human emotion in accurately, but in its full kind of rawness, but also to have a social a social and political commitment. And a lot of people in the group theatre were members of the Communist Party, which is a matter that influences the story of the play. And after the war, when communism became anathema in America, then in a way, the work of the group theatre and the plays that came out of that, you could say in some ways became more about, more Freudian, more about, individual motivation. But it kept in the greatest plays, it kept that sense that we were not just talking about the individuals we were looking at and their interactions, but we were talking about a whole society. And I think, the really great plays, of which Miller certainly wrote several, as did Williams, as did O'Neill, as did Odets. Odets a bit earlier. That those plays, still stand on that rock on that double rock of naturalism, of trying to present the world as a mirror to itself accurately, particularly human interactions, but also to have a social and political intent. And that's why I think Miller in particular, who's the most revived playwright, most revived post-war playwright. I mean, there's more Shakespeare than Miller, and there's a lot of Chekhov, but Miller is the big 20th century revived playwright in my country, and that's because of that impact on the way we all think plays should be.
There was a lot of what the play is about has to do with the Red Scare, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the naming of names, those who did and those who didn't. There's a sequence of events that I think is, his history is something of interest to me, but it's certainly not something that I would claim a great deal of scholarship in or about. But the way I see the history unfolding is the Bolshevik revolution in the right at the near the beginning of the 20th century, um, followed by this terrible war, this First World War, which seemed to, be meaningless and introduce to the world the idea of existential angst, I guess, and then the downturn, the crash, we think of it as 1929 forward, followed by the Second World War, and the degree to which um, the Roosevelt administration, put people back to work at the end of or during uh, the Depression. So the government stepped in other words, and tried to make things correct. And then at the end of World War II, the sense that, at least in some people's minds, that the Soviets were the ones who had actually defeated this fascist dictator in Europe. And then, so all these things seem to be leading toward a tomorrow of at least socialist ideas, if not outright communist ideas. And then here comes Joe McCarthy, and suddenly all of that history gets wrapped up in a ball and forgotten about, basically. Is that an accurate reading of history? And do you think that there was a chance that communism ever could have worked in the West?
Well, I think if I was to do the history fairly, or look at both sides of it, obviously the other thing that happened was that the Red Army took over great swathes of Eastern Europe, which had been independent, not always wonderful democracies, and
Mhm.
certainly democracies with countries with lots of issues about their treatment of Jews, for example, in the interwar years, but certainly much more independent than they ended up being. And I think that sense that, and also there were the facts of the Soviet repression in the 1930s and the show trials and so on, and the man-made famines, and the purges and so on, that they were becoming increasingly. I mean, people knew about them before, but they were becoming increasingly, publicly known, and the nature of the Soviet regime. Counter to that, as you say, is the fact that that regime had had saved Europe from Hitler, and there's absolutely, I mean, just numerically, uh, there's
The
absolutely
fact
no
that,
doubt
yeah,
that the Red Army was the principal agent of defeating Hitler. Um, you know, Britain and America and the other allies played an undoubted and important part towards the end, but those long years when there wasn't a British or American boot on continental Europe, were the years that actually ultimately allowed the final outcome to occur. And I think that the question about post-war, the post-war, as you say, Red Scare, is whether or not there was a genuine fear that communist ideology would take over America, or whether or not this was a way of attacking the New Deal, that it was associating the government intervention, which had undoubtedly ended the ended the Great Depression and got America back to work, and saved people who otherwise would have continued in terrible penury. That was, that was the gateway to communism, and that was sort of personalized in people who were, in some cases justly, in many cases unjustly, accused of being conscious communist agents, as opposed to supporters of what we in Europe would call socialist economics, and you in America more usually call liberal economics. Um, so I think and I'm personally convinced that McCarthyism was an attempt to roll back those gains, and indeed, to a certain extent did so quite successfully. But obviously the excesses, the show trials, indeed, the purges, indeed, which ironically, the McCarthyites were imposing exactly the kind of political mechanisms which Soviet Russia was rightly criticized for. Those became eventually so excessive that a number of brave individuals stood up, as history tells us, in the early to mid 50s, and said enough is enough. And McCarthy's efforts, his motivations were exposed, and a much more liberal democracy emerged.
We do see communist finger pointing and socialist finger pointing in the West a lot whenever somebody who has ideas that seem similar to what was happening during Roosevelt's administration. It feels like that is still a weapon that can quickly be drawn and used in your country
Well,
and
indeed.
mine.
Indeed, and obviously the big social transformations of the last of my lifetime, but since the late 60s, when I was in my very early 20s, which are about groups of people who are marginalized on the grounds of ethnicity and gender and other things. The effort to roll back that marginalization, which has been the big story. And when you hear, if I can draw an elephant in the room analogy, when you see your current government treating diversity and inclusion as a leftist ideology, and demanding that people cease to practice or organize their practice on the basis of it, in the government, and if they don't do so, they're accused of being leftist infiltrators, and their colleagues are encouraged to snitch on them. Then it's impossible not to see parallels between what was
Sure.
happening then and what was happening now, and in all other, in many other respects, the attack on Hollywood, the purging of books in libraries, it goes on and on, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's when during the second campaign, his second presidential campaign, Donald Trump accused Kamala Harris of being a Marxist. Then that immediately gives an echo. Kamala Harris is not a Marxist.
No, no.
I mean, she's a liberal Democrat who doubtless has views about the role of the state in the economy, which Donald Trump doesn't share. But accusing people who aren't Marxist of being Marxist is when you might say you've got perfectly good things to accuse them of accurately,
Indeed.
is absolutely from the early 50s playbook.
Yeah. I know you don't have much more time. I wanted to very quickly ask about the character in the play that is Marilyn Monroe. The two men are the ones who we think of when we think of this um, debate to name names or not to name names, to go along, to get along or not. But Marilyn is kind of a voice of conscience in a way. It seems like in the play she's sort of leading them toward their best selves. Is that a fair way of looking at that?
Yes, I think I've been nervous in this conversation because we had a reading of the play earlier, and it's now moving into the British evening. And we didn't have the 5 minute conversation about spoiler alerts.
Uh-huh.
So I've been very gently trying to take from you what one could say or not say about the play. And I think in my view, we have avoided saying all the things to be avoided, while obviously describing the milieu, which will be obvious within 10 minutes of the play starting,
Yeah.
where we are and what the play's about. So I think it's not a spoiler alert to say, or if it is, you've already done
I've
it,
done it.
to say that Marilyn Monroe was a crucial figure in for both Kazan, who at the time of the play, like Kazan was having a love affair with a physical love affair with Marilyn Monroe, and for Arthur Miller, who was in love with her, and in a sense, she was in love with him. So he, she was a point of contact between the two men, and although the play is set almost entirely in on the East Coast and for much of its length in Connecticut, and Marilyn Monroe is not a direct physical presence. Although she becomes so, she is an important, I mean, legitimately an important figure because she was an important figure in the lives of both men. She was very, I mean, she was left wing. She she supported the ideals of the left. She was certainly very liberal, properly in my view, on issues of race. There was a club in Hollywood which refused to book Ella Fitzgerald, and Monroe said, using her power at that stage in her career, said that she would come every night that Ella Fitzgerald performed in that club and sit in the front row, which obviously had attractions beyond the very considerable attractions of being able to listen to Ella Fitzgerald. So she stood up for that, and I think she felt very strongly that I think again it's not spoiling anything fundamental to say that she would not have been in favour of the activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee and their hearings. And I've taken that and reflect that in the play. I don't think I think there's anything in the portrayal, I hope, of any of the four characters. Elia Kazan's wife Molly is also a character, which isn't, historically accurate. I haven't taken real people with more complicated views and made them spokesmen of particular things, in a way that isn't justified, I think, by what actually happened.
Okay, David, last question. You wrote this play and had this play performed at the Orange Tree, which is quite a small theater. It's about the size of ours, actually, while having a very large play done at a very large theater, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and they ran more or less almost simultaneously. I just was wondering if what that experience was like for you, and if one in any way influenced the other.
Well, in a practical sense, never again. But we had two. Luckily, the Royal Shakespeare Company does most of its rehearsals in London, a fact of which I don't entirely approve, but in this case was a great convenience, so that I was able to. I mean, I literally, was commuting between two sets of rehearsals on quite long subway journeys, hoping that they wouldn't be too crowded, so that I could be rewriting one on the way to the other and the other on the way back to the first one. And they were 2 weeks apart. So we had 2 weeks of here in America rehearsals, and then the other place, it's called the New Reel, began rehearsals. And I think the first day of rehearsals in Stratford, when the company moved up the motorway to Stratford after having rehearsed in London, that was the day of my press night at the Orange Tree in Richmond. So there was a period in the middle of it when I was literally doing both, and that was not it was an exciting experience to remember, but it certainly wasn't the perfect way of doing it, and it arose out of the fact the schedules of the two theatres, but it was great to have them both on. They share certain themes. The New Reel is also about Americans. It's about American political consultants working in Eastern Europe, which certainly happens and happened. And it's about two American political consultants who end up on either side of a highly contested election in a fictional Eastern European country, and it's based on things that happened in Ukraine and Hungary and other real existing Eastern European countries. And the thesis of the play is that some of at least of the populist agenda, which we see with Trump and Nigel Farage in my country, and a number of parties and movements in Europe, some of them in power, some of them not, that arose partly out of responses to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the new democracies in Eastern Europe. Some of that populist agenda was as it were developed in the East and moved westwards. And a figure who's not directly represented in the play, but the figure of Paul Manafort, who was indeed political consultant to a winning East European candidate in Ukraine, then of course became Donald Trump's campaign manager, and eventually ended up in jail. So there's a factual basis for that. So in a way, in a historical way in here in America, and in a more contemporary way in the New Reel, I was talking about the big political story of our time, which is national populism.
And in the other sort of how we've gotten there, it seems to me, or at least a substantial step in that direction. Well, David, thank you very much. I appreciate your letting us do your play, and I appreciate your joining us for the podcast. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and then you and I might have another minute or two to talk. And
absolutely.
And Here in America will perform at Burning Coal December 4th through 21st. BurningCoal.org is the website, and we hope you'll all join us for that.